Chapter 1. You're replaceable. There's a specific kind of silence that happens right before your life splits in two. It was 9:07 a.m. on a Tuesday. Quarterly staff meeting. Conference room B. The one with the long walnut table and the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked downtown Chicago. The skyline looked sharp and indifferent that morning, like it had no interest in what was about to happen to me. I remember because I was holding a yellow legal pad and tapping my pen against it, waiting for my turn to present the Q3 projections. I had stayed up until 2:14 a.m. the night before polishing those slides. My name is Caroline Hayes. I was 38 years old. Senior Operations Director at Westbridge Consumer Solutions. 12 years in the company. 8 promotions. 0 disciplinary issues. I trained half the management team sitting in that room, and in less than 3 minutes, none of that would matter. My boss, Daniel Mercer, stood at the head of the table, hands clasped behind his back like he was about to deliver a sermon. Daniel had that polished executive look, perfect navy suit, silver hair at the temples, voice that carried without ever needing to rise. He believed in hierarchy. In optics. In reminding people who signed their paychecks, before we moved to projections, he said, glancing down at his tablet, there's been a leadership reassessment. The word reassessment felt clinical. Clean. I felt my stomach tighten. He turned his head slightly. Not fully toward me. Just enough. Caroline, stand up for a moment. The room shifted. Chairs creaked. 23 pairs of eyes lifted. I stood. My heels clicked softly against the hardwood floor. Daniel sighed. Not heavily, just enough to suggest disappointment. We've appreciated your time here, he began. Appreciated, past tense. My heartbeat moved into my throat. However, after reviewing performance alignment with future strategy, we've decided to move in a different direction. Different direction. It sounded like I'd become furniture that no longer matched the decor. There was a buzzing in my ears. I could feel heat rising from my collarbone to my cheeks. I don't understand, I said, and I hated how steady my voice sounded. I wanted it to tremble. I wanted someone to hear what this meant. Daniel finally looked directly at me, and then he smiled. It wasn't cruel. That's what made it worse. It was dismissive. Caroline, he said, in that calm, executive tone, you're replaceable. Not loud. Not shouted, just stated. A fact. The air left my lungs. Somewhere to my right, someone inhaled sharply. I think it was Megan from finance. But no one spoke. Daniel continued, we need agility. Fresh perspective. Adaptability. And frankly, we've identified stronger leadership candidates internally. Internally, meaning someone in that room. I scanned faces, eyes dropped. Throats swallowed. One of the VPs avoided looking at me entirely. 12 years. I thought about the late nights. The Christmas Eves I spent finalizing contracts. The hospital conference calls when my mother was recovering from surgery. The mentorship programs I built from scratch. Replaceable. Daniel gestured toward the door. HR will walk you through next steps. We'll transition your accounts by end of day. End of day. I was still holding my legal pad. I slowly placed it on the table. May I ask, I said carefully, what specific performance metrics I failed to meet? He tilted his head. This isn't personal. It's structural. Structural. I realized then that he hadn't mentioned a single mistake. Not one. That he just wanted me gone, and he wanted everyone watching to understand that if it could happen to me, it could happen to them. I felt something inside me fracture, but it wasn't despair. It was clarity, because when someone fires you publicly, without data, without warning, without dignity, it isn't restructuring. It's theater. And Daniel Mercer loved an audience. I picked up my bag.no1 stopped me.no1 defended me.as I reached the door. Daniel added one last line, security will deactivate your access in 30 minutes. Security, like I might steal something. I nodded once, and I walked out. The hallway felt longer than usual. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. My reflection followed me in the glass panels lining the corridor. I looked composed. Too composed. In the elevator, I finally let my shoulders drop. My phone buzzed. A text from Megan. I'm so sorry. This wasn't right. I stared at it. That wasn't right. But no one had spoken. I stepped into the lobby. The security guard at the front desk avoided eye contact. I had hired him. 2 years earlier, after budget negotiations. He scanned my badge. The light turned red. Access revoked. Just like that. Outside, the October wind cut through my blazer. The city moved on. Taxis honked. People crossed streets. A man argued into his Bluetooth headset like nothing had shifted in the universe, but my universe had that. I got into my car, and I didn't cry, not yet. Instead, I replayed the meeting in my head. You're replaceable. It wasn't the firing that echoed at it, was the certainty in his voice that he believed it, and that's when the anger finally arrived, not explosive, cold, measured. Because Daniel Mercer had made one critical mistake, that he thought my value was limited to a job title, that he forgot something very important, that I knew the company inside and out, that I knew the operational inefficiencies they hid from investors, that I knew the vendor contracts expiring next quarter, that I knew the upcoming audit vulnerabilities, that I knew which senior managers were quietly job hunting, and I knew something else. Westbridge wasn't as stable as it looked, that I had helped build its growth strategy, that I also knew its weaknesses. And when someone underestimates you publicly, when they reduce 12 years of loyalty to one word, replaceable, they create a very specific kind of motivation. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I wasn't thinking about unemployment, that I was thinking about leverage. Daniel believed he had removed me from the equation, but what he had actually done was free me from it, and I had just begun calculating. Chapter 2. The quiet inventory. That I didn't tell anyone I'd been fired, not that day, not the next, for 48 hours. I woke up at 6 a.m. out of habit, showered, made coffee, and sat at my kitchen island staring at my laptop like I still had somewhere to be. The first morning, I opened my email instinctively. Access denied. That it was strange how quickly a digital lockout can erase you. 12 years of threads, strategies, negotiations, internal battles, gone behind a password I no longer had. But Daniel had underestimated one thing, that I never relied on memory alone. For years, I had kept personal notes. Not confidential files, nothing illegal. Just observations. Patterns. Concerns. Strategic ideas I believed the board would never approve under Daniel's leadership, that I had always planned to use them one day, just not like this. By the third morning, the shock had thinned into something sharper, focused. That I sat at my dining table with a legal pad and wrote 3 columns at the top of the page: assets. Weaknesses. Leverage, If Daniel thought I was replaceable, I needed to determine whether he was under assets. I wrote vendor relationships, 12 direct contacts, former team loyalty, operational knowledge, expansion plan 2025, investor presentation drafts, acquisition targets, 2 pending. Under weaknesses, cash flow dependency on Q4 retail surge, overextended Midwest distribution center, pending compliance review, 2 senior managers planning exit, inflated growth projections for board. Under leverage, I paused, then I wrote one name, Evelyn Grant, Evelyn was the largest minority shareholder at Westbridge. Quiet. Calculated. Rarely present in daily operations. She believed in numbers, not personalities. Daniel charmed rooms, Evelyn studied balance sheets. That I had met with her twice during strategic reviews. She had asked me questions Daniel never did, about scalability, sustainability, risk exposure. At the time, I thought she was simply thorough. Now I wondered if she had been evaluating something else. On Friday afternoon, my phone rang, unknown number. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. Caroline Hayes. A pause, then a calm, controlled female voice. This is Evelyn Grant. My spine straightened. I heard about the restructuring, she said. Restructuring? That I almost laughed. Yes, I replied carefully. Another pause. I found the public handling inefficient. That was Evelyn's version of outrage. That I swallowed. I appreciate you saying that. I have a question, she continued. Were you aware of the updated distribution forecasts before your dismissal? There it was, the real reason for the call. Yes, I said, and? I took a breath. They're unrealistic. Silence, not uncomfortable. Analytical, explain. So I did that. I walked her through the inflated demand assumptions. The underreported logistical bottlenecks. The compliance review Daniel had downplayed in the last board's summary. That I didn't embellish, that I didn't attack, that I presented facts. When I finished, Evelyn spoke slowly. Daniel told the board you were resistant to innovation. I almost smiled. I was resistant to mathematical fiction. A faint exhale on the other end. Not quite laughter. I see, she said. Then, would you be willing to meet? The following Tuesday, I walked into a private conference suite overlooking Lake Michigan, not as an employee. As a free agent. Evelyn was already seated when I arrived. Late 60s. Sharp gray bob. Dark emerald blazer. Eyes that missed nothing. She didn't stand, sit, Caroline. No pleasantries. No small talk. I reviewed the numbers. She began. You were correct. A small, steady warmth spread through my chest. The board is unaware of the compliance exposure, she continued. Daniel assured us everything was contained. It isn't, I said. She studied me. Why didn't you raise this directly before? There it was, the question beneath the question. Why hadn't I fought harder? Because Daniel controls the meeting agenda, I said calmly. And because challenging him publicly would have destabilized investor confidence without structural backing. Evelyn nodded once. You're strategic. I'm cautious. Same thing, she replied. She leaned back. If Westbridge underperforms Q4, valuation will dip. Yes. And if compliance issues surface simultaneously? Share price drops significantly. And if someone were positioned to acquire additional equity during that dip? My pulse slowed, not quickened, slowed. You're considering increasing your stake, I said. I'm considering options. Options, that word again. The room felt very still. I was told you signed a standard severance, Evelyn said. I did. With a non-disparagement clause. Yes. Does it restrict investment activity? No, her lips curved slightly. Good. We sat in silence for a long moment. Then she said something that shifted everything. Daniel believes leadership is authority. She leaned forward. I believe leadership is ownership. And in that moment, something aligned, not revenge, not yet, opportunity. Over the next 6 weeks, I did something unexpected. That I didn't job hunt aggressively. That I consulted quietly. 2 former colleagues reached out within days of my departure. One from operations. One from finance, both unhappy, both uncertain. Daniel's leadership style had intensified since my exit. Fear is efficient in the short term. IT corrodes in the long term. Meanwhile, Westbridge's Q4 projections began to wobble exactly where I predicted: shipping delays, vendor penalties, internal friction. The stock dipped 8%, then 12%. Financial blogs noticed. Investors grew cautious. Evelyn called me twice during that period, short conversations. Data focused, neutral tone, but I could feel something building. Then, in early December, compliance issues surfaced publicly. A minor filing irregularity, but enough to spark scrutiny. The stock dropped another 17% in 48 hours. Daniel held an emergency press call. He sounded confident, controlled, reassuring, but I recognized the tension beneath his cadence. He was improvising, and Daniel was never at his best without a script. That night, Evelyn sent me a single message, ***, now. The following week, I invested more money than I had ever risked in my life, not recklessly, strategically. I liquidated a conservative portfolio I'd built over a decade. Diversified holdings. Safe returns, and I bought Westbridge shares. At a discount, not enough to control, but enough to matter. Evelyn increased her stake as well. Quietly. No headlines. No declarations, just numbers shifting behind the curtain. By mid-January, Westbridge's valuation began stabilizing, not because of Daniel, because institutional investors noticed insider confidence. Markets respond to patterns we had created. And then Evelyn did something bold. She requested a formal board review of executive performance. Daniel would have to defend his strategy, publicly, with data in front of shareholders, the same way he had dismissed me, publicly, without it. The night before the board meeting, I stood in my kitchen again, different feeling this time. The anger had evolved. IT wasn't about humiliation anymore. IT was about correction. Daniel believed I was replaceable because he measured value in titles. He forgot that influence doesn't disappear when access badges deactivate. IT recalibrates, and tomorrow. For the first time since that Tuesday morning, I would walk back into Westbridge, not as senior operations director, but as a shareholder, with voting power and patience. Chapter 3, The Boardroom Return. The first thing I noticed when I stepped back into Westbridge headquarters was the smell, lemon polish and recycled air. Somehow, it felt smaller. Or maybe I had grown. The lobby receptionist looked up as the elevator doors opened. Her eyes widened just slightly before she rearranged her expression into something neutral. Good morning, I said calmly. Good morning. Ms. Hayes. Not Caroline from Ops. Ms. Hayes, that was new. I signed in as a shareholder representative, temporary access badge issued, green light, access granted. It was almost poetic. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. in conference room A. The the executive suite Daniel rarely allowed mid-level leadership to enter. I arrived at 9:47. Evelyn was already seated at the far end of the long glass table. Two other board members flipped through printed financial packets. Quiet murmurs filled the room, then the door opened behind me. Daniel walked in. He stopped, just for half a second, but I saw it: recognition, confusion, calculation. He recovered quickly, of course. He always did, Caroline, he said smoothly, setting his leather portfolio on the table. I wasn't aware you'd be joining us. Evelyn didn't look up from her folder. She won't be joining us, she said evenly. She already has. Daniel's jaw tightened. Barely. I held his gaze. I've increased my equity position, I said. Significantly. Silence fell across the room. Daniel pulled out his chair. Well, he said lightly, we always welcome investor engagement. But his tone had changed, less certain, more alert. The meeting began formally: quarterly overview, revenue adjustments, market fluctuations. Then Evelyn shifted the tone. Let's address compliance exposure, she said. Daniel nodded. Contained. Explain, she replied. He launched into a polished summary. Phrases like minor reporting discrepancy and procedural oversight. Then she asked the question he wasn't prepared for: why were distribution center liabilities excluded from the October forecast? Daniel blinked. They weren't excluded. Evelyn slid a document across the table. They were. I recognized the spreadsheet instantly. My projections, the ones he had dismissed as resistant to innovation. He flipped through the pages, buying time. The numbers were preliminary. They were accurate, I said calmly. Every head in the room turned toward me. Daniel smiled thinly. With respect, Caroline, you no longer have access to internal. I don't need access, I interrupted softly. I built the model. Silence. One board member cleared his throat. Is the exposure real or not, Daniel? The question hung heavy. Daniel adjusted his cufflinks. It's manageable. That wasn't the question, Evelyn said. The room shifted. Power is subtle. IT doesn't shout. IT waits. For the next 40 minutes, the narrative unraveled: underreported shipping penalties, vendor attrition risk. A pending internal audit triggered by compliance irregularities, none catastrophic individually, but collectively, unstable. Daniel defended each point, individually. But he couldn't defend the pattern, and that was the difference between him and me. He managed moments. I managed systems. Then came the vote. Executive performance reviewed. A formal process to determine confidence in leadership. Daniel leaned back. Confident smile restored. He believed relationships would save him. He had cultivated loyalty carefully, but loyalty built on fear has a shelf life. Votes were cast privately. One by one. When the final tally was handed to Evelyn, she read it silently, then she looked up. The board has voted to initiate transitional leadership planning. Daniel's smile froze. Transitional, he repeated. Yes. That's unnecessary, he said, a flicker of irritation slipping through. It's decisive, Evelyn replied. His gaze shifted to me. Understanding dawned slowly. You orchestrated this, he said quietly. I didn't smile. I analyzed it. After the meeting, board members filtered out. Some avoided eye contact, some didn't. Daniel remained seated. So, he said finally, standing. What's your endgame? I considered the question carefully. Months ago, I might have said revenge, but standing there, watching the certainty drain from his posture, I realized something. This was never about humiliation. It was about correction. My endgame, I said, is sustainable leadership. He laughed softly. You think you can run this company? I met his eyes. I already was. For the first time since I'd known him, Daniel didn't have a response ready. 2 weeks later, he announced his resignation. Personal reasons. The press release was polished, dignified, strategic. But insiders knew. Markets responded positively. Stock rose 9% in a single day. Investors like stability, and they like accountability more. The board convened again to discuss interim leadership. Several names were floated: external candidates, internal VPs. Then Evelyn spoke. There is a candidate with operational fluency, investor confidence, and strategic foresight, she said. I stayed silent. Caroline Hayes. The room grew still. One board member hesitated. She was recently terminated for disagreeing with unsustainable projections, Evelyn corrected. Which proved accurate. Another added, public optics could be complicated. Public optics, Evelyn said coolly, favor competence. She looked at me. Are you interested? My pulse thudded in my ears. This was the moment, not of revenge, out of responsibility. Yes, I said, not loudly, not triumphantly, just clearly. The vote passed, interim CEO, effective immediately that I walked out of that building that afternoon with a new badge, permanent access, corner office, authority not granted through favor, but earned through foresight that as I stood inside what used to be Daniel's office, overlooking the same skyline. I thought about that Tuesday morning. You're replaceable. Maybe I was that IN title, that IN position, but value compounds, and when you understand the architecture of something deeply enough, you don't need permission to rebuild it, you just need timing, and mine had arrived. Chapter 4, Ownership. The first week as interim CEO felt less like a victory and more like walking into a house after a storm. Nothing was visibly destroyed, but everything had shifted. Daniel's name was still on internal documents. His framed leadership awards still hung outside the executive corridor. His strategic roadmap was pinned to the operations wall like gospel, and yet, people moved differently, cautiously, watching me, waiting. Leadership isn't claimed in a board vote. It's tested in hallways. My first executive meeting as CEO took place in the same room where I had been fired, conference room B. Walnut table. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Downtown Chicago glittering in late winter sunlight. I stood at the head of the table, not to imitate Daniel, but because visibility matters. 22 faces looked back at me, some relieved, some skeptical. A few calculating. I want to address something directly, I began. What happened in this room 3 months ago was not restructuring. Silence, it was fear management. No one moved. I won't lead that way. The air shifted, subtle, but real. We have real exposure in distribution. Real vendor trust issues. Real morale erosion. We fix those first. Growth comes second. One of the VPs raised his hand carefully. Are we revising projections publicly? Yes. A ripple of unease that could drop the stock again. Temporarily, I said. Transparency stabilizes long term. Fiction destabilizes permanently. No one argued. That was the first sign change was possible. By week 2, I had scheduled individual meetings with every department head, not to assert authority. Listen, patterns emerged quickly. Under Daniel, communication had flowed upward only. Bad news was softened, concerns filtered, risks diluted. People weren't incompetent, they were intimidated. Fear had inflated numbers and suppressed warnings. Which meant Westbridge hadn't been failing because of lack of talent. IT had been failing because of leadership ego, and ego is expensive. One afternoon, Megan from finance stepped into my office, the same Megan who had texted, "This wasn't right." She closed the door behind her. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For coming back." I studied her face. How close were we? I asked. She didn't pretend to misunderstand. Closer than the board knows. To what? Insolvency within 18 months if Q4 had missed. My stomach tightened, not in panic, but in validation. The math had been worse than even I'd projected. "We'll fix it," I said. She nodded. "I know." That was new, confidence not rooted in intimidation, but in belief. Publicly, the transition was framed as strategic renewal. Privately, it was reconstruction. We renegotiated vendor contracts with honesty instead of leverage threats. We delayed the Midwest expansion to stabilize cash flow. We voluntarily disclosed compliance adjustments before regulators forced us to. The stock dipped again. Financial media speculated. One headline read, Westbridge faces turbulent reset under new leadership. I didn't flinch. Resets feel turbulent when you're accustomed to illusion. Then came the moment I didn't expect. Daniel requested a meeting, not with the board, with me. He arrived on a gray Thursday afternoon. No navy power suit this time, charcoal. Subdued. He stood in the doorway of what used to be his office. "May I?" he asked. I gestured to the chair across from my desk. We sat in silence for several seconds. He looked older, not dramatically, just less certain. "I underestimated you," he said finally. "IT wasn't an apology. IT was an admission." "Yes," I replied calmly. He exhaled softly. "I believed leadership was authority," he continued. "I believed decisiveness required dominance." "And now?" I asked. He glanced toward the skyline. "I see the difference between control and ownership." There it was, ownership, the word Evelyn had used months ago. "You called me replaceable," I said, not accusing, just factual. He nodded. "I was wrong." Silence settled between us, not hostile, reflective. "Why fire me publicly?" I asked. His jaw tightened slightly, "Because I thought others needed to see that no one was indispensable." "And now?" "Now I understand the cost of proving that." After he left, I stood by the window that I didn't feel triumph that I felt completion, because revenge burns hot and fast, but correction endures. Daniel's removal hadn't been about humiliation, that it had been about recalibrating a system that was drifting toward collapse, and systems don't change through emotion, they change through structure. 3 months later, Westbridge reported stabilized earnings. Not explosive, not glamorous, stable. Investor confidence strengthened, employee turnover decreased by 34%, vendor retention rose, compliance audit cleared, and the stock began climbing, slowly, steadily, compounding, just like value. One evening, long after most of the building had emptied, I walked back into conference room B. The same room where my career had supposedly ended. That I stood where I had stood that Tuesday morning. That I could almost hear it again: "You're replaceable." But here's the truth no one teaches you early in your career: everyone is replaceable in position. An O1 is replaceable in perspective. The knowledge you build, the patterns you recognize, the discipline you develop, that doesn't vanish when someone deactivates your badge. It transfers. It adapts. It waits. And if you're patient enough, it compounds into ownership. I didn't buy Westbridge to prove Daniel wrong. That I bought it because I understood it, because I knew its fractures and its strengths, because I could see beyond quarterly ego metrics, because I was never replaceable. That I was foundational, and foundations don't need applause, they need time. 6 months after that Tuesday morning, I stood before the entire company at our annual leadership summit. Same building, different stage. That I looked out at hundreds of employees, some who had watched me walk out months earlier, some who had wondered if they'd be next. "I want to start with a story," I said. No slides, no script. Earlier this year, I was told I was replaceable. A ripple through the crowd, and in one sense, that was true. Murmurs quieted. Titles are replaceable. Roles are replaceable. Even executives are replaceable. I paused, but integrity isn't. Silence settled fully. Competence isn't. Another beat, and leadership built on fear always collapses under its own weight. No applause yet, just listening. I stand here not because I wasn't replaceable, I finished, but because I understood something more powerful. I let the words land. Ownership outlasts authority. This time, the applause came, not explosive, but steady, sustained, real. That night, I drove home through downtown Chicago with the windows cracked, cold air cutting against my skin. That I thought about the woman who had walked out of that building months earlier, humiliated, dismissed, labeled. She didn't know she was walking toward ownership. She thought she was losing everything. But sometimes the moment that looks like expulsion is actually elevation, and sometimes the person who calls you replaceable is simply revealing how replaceable they are. Chapter 5: Replaceable. Exactly 1 year after the day I was fired, I scheduled a full company town hall, not because quarterly numbers demanded it, not because the board requested it, because anniversaries matter, especially the ones that tried to break you. Conference room B couldn't hold everyone anymore, so we used the auditorium downstairs. Rows of employees filled the space: operations, finance, marketing, logistics, HR. Some had been with Westbridge longer than I had. Others were new, hired after the restructuring. The company felt different now, lighter, not naive, just honest. That I stood backstage for a moment before walking out. That I didn't feel nervous. That I felt grounded. There's a difference. When I stepped into the lights, the applause was immediate. Not because I was CEO, because they had lived the transition with me. That I waited until the room quieted. Today marks 1 year since a leadership change that reshaped this company. I began. That I didn't dramatize it. That I didn't need to. 1 year ago, I was told I was replaceable. A ripple moved through the audience. Some of them had been in that meeting. Some had only heard whispers. I've thought about that word a lot. I let the silence settle. Replaceable. I walked slowly across the stage. In business school, they teach you about competitive advantage, market differentiation, scalability. A faint smile. They don't teach you what happens when someone reduces your entire contribution to one word. No one moved. When I left this building that morning, I had 2 options. I held up 2 fingers. I could internalize it, or I could investigate it. The word lingered, investigate. Because that's what I had done. That I hadn't reacted emotionally. I hadn't lashed out publicly. I hadn't posted vague messages online or tried to damage reputations. That I had studied the system. I asked myself a question. I continued. If I'm replaceable, what exactly are they replacing? The room leaned in. My title? Yes. My access badge? Yes. My salary? Yes. I paused, my understanding of this company. Silence, my knowledge of its vulnerabilities. Its vendor history. Its internal culture. Its structural risks. A beat, no, after the town hall, employees lined up, not to congratulate me, but to share their own stories. A project manager told me she had almost resigned after watching my firing. A warehouse supervisor admitted he'd stopped reporting minor errors out of fear they'd be used against him. A junior analyst said, "When you came back as a shareholder, that changed something for all of us." That part mattered most, because this story was never just about me buying stock. It was about shifting the definition of power inside an organization. Authority can fire someone in a meeting, ownership changes who runs the meeting. 6 weeks later, Westbridge finalized something I had been quietly working toward since becoming CEO. We launched an employee equity program, not symbolic. Substantial. High-performing managers and long-term staff would receive share allocations tied to transparent performance metrics. Ownership, distributed. At the announcement meeting, someone asked, "Why now?" I didn't hesitate because companies are strongest when value is shared. But privately, the answer was simpler, because I never wanted another capable woman, or man, standing in a conference room, being told they were replaceable without understanding their real leverage. One afternoon, nearly 14 months after my dismissal, I received a handwritten letter, actual paper, from Daniel. I sat at my desk and opened it carefully. The handwriting was controlled, deliberate. "Caroline, I've spent the past year consulting, observing, listening more than speaking. I've realized something uncomfortable. I confused indispensability with authority. I believed removing strong people proved my strength. It proved the opposite. You didn't defeat me, you exposed me. I folded the letter slowly. There was no bitterness in it. No attempt to reclaim status, just reflection, and strangely, that felt like the final piece, because true correction isn't complete until everyone learns something, even the person who caused the fracture. That evening, I walked through the operations floor alone. The Midwest expansion we had paused was now back on track, scaled realistically, financed responsibly. Distribution delays were down 62%, vendor relationships had stabilized, turnover had dropped below industry average. Westbridge wasn't the fastest growing company in our sector anymore. It was the most stable, and stability compounds, just like ownership. There's a myth about revenge, that it's loud, that it ends in public humiliation, that the person who wronged you must watch you rise from the front row, but the most effective revenge is structural. It's building something so solid that the insult becomes irrelevant. I didn't need Daniel to see me succeed. I needed the system to function correctly, and it did. A year and a half after I was fired, I stood once more in conference room B, alone. Sunlight streamed through the same floor-to-ceiling windows. The skyline hadn't changed, but I walked to the exact spot where I had stood when Daniel said it. "You're replaceable." I could still hear the cadence, calm, dismissive, certain. And now the word felt different, because he had been right in one narrow sense. Anyone can be replaced in a role. But what he didn't understand was this: if you truly understand the architecture of a system, you don't need the role, you can own the system. People often ask me now, in interviews or panels, what was the turning point? They expect me to say the board meeting. Or the stock purchase. Or the vote. But the turning point wasn't external. It happened in my driveway the afternoon I was fired, when I chose not to cry, not yet, when I chose to think. That was the pivot, not anger, analysis, not humiliation, strategy. That's the difference between reacting and recalibrating. Here's what I've learned. When someone fires you publicly to demonstrate power, they're revealing insecurity. When someone calls you replaceable without data, they're exposing fear. And when a system punishes competence instead of rewarding it, the system, not the person, needs restructuring. I didn't win because I was smarter. Or more ruthless. Or more ambitious. I won because I understood timing, and I understood leverage. 2 years after my dismissal, Westbridge's valuation surpassed its previous peak, not explosively, steadily. Investor confidence remained strong, employee engagement hit record highs. The board removed the word interim from my title permanently. CEO, official, uncontested. The press framed it as a comeback story. It wasn't. Comebacks imply returning to where you were. I didn't return. I elevated. If you had told me on that Tuesday morning, 9:07 a.m., yellow legal pad in hand, that within 2 years I would own a controlling stake in the company that fired me, I would have laughed, not because I lacked ambition, because I didn't yet understand what humiliation can fuel when filtered through discipline. Pain is volatile, discipline is compounding, and when you combine the two carefully, you don't just recover, you restructure. I still keep that yellow legal pad, the one I was holding when Daniel said it sits in the top drawer of my desk, not as a reminder of humiliation, but as proof of inflection. Every time I open that drawer, I see it, and I remember, the worst room of your career might become the foundation of your ownership. The word meant to diminish you might become your leverage, and the person who calls you replaceable might unknowingly free you to become irreplaceable. If I could speak to the woman walking out of that building 1 year ago, shoulders stiff, badge deactivated, heartbeat echoing in her ears, I'd tell her this: don't rush to defend yourself. Don't beg for reconsideration. Don't shrink to preserve someone else's ego. Study the system, learn its fractures, wait for the moment when correction is possible, and when it comes, don't ask for your job back by the company.